Join me in welcoming Melissa Shilukung Atan Ichichkak, Martin, and Casey Kunmeku Hapson.
Hello, good morning. I was like, what time is it? Atira Kunmeru, Nalwaramitun Casey Hobson, Iniberunga, Angayukaka Muriel Hobson Lu, Safdar Hussein Lu, Asi Adatakab, Ben Hobson Senior Lu, Jeanette Hobson Lu, Hassan Jani Lu, Pahlavan Khan Lu. So good morning, everyone. Uvla Lotak. I just briefly introduced myself in Inibak. I am still learning, so I may make a mistake here and there, but I am Kunmiru. That's my Inupiaq name. I also have the name Puruk, if any of you know any other Puruks out there. My English name is Casey Hobson. I am Inupiaq from the North Slope communities of Aloganik, also known as Wainwright, and Karovik, formerly known as Barrow. And I've made my home here on Dena'ina homelands for quite a while, so I always like to pay my respects to the Dena'ina peoples for their ongoing stewardship of this place, and it's because of that that I'm able to be here, and we're all able to be here today doing this work. And at First Alaskans Institute, I serve in our Alaska Native Policy Center in Indigenous and Government Affairs. What that means is that I get to meet folks like you all and talk about our Alaska Native governance and protocols, the laws and policies that shape our world, and just share a thing or two about engaging with our Native communities. So that's why we're here today. I'll pass it over to Shiluk, and then we'we'll share about.
Yeah. Chumai, everybody. We Shilukanatanichkak up to Hutna Melissa Martin. Shunami Shuklianga, Ferndale me, Igdachluga, Pektachluga. So I'm still learning as well. My Shukhstun name is Shilukanatanichkak. I'm originally from Kodiak Island, but now I live in Ferndale, Washington. So I am living in Coast Salish territory where I get to live and work with my daughter, who is a college student. I'm so excited. And my other daughter just lives a few hours south of me. So I moved for family reasons. My home is Alaska, and I'm very fortunate and blessed to work for an organization that brings me back and forth on a regular basis. I'm FAI's Indigenous Operations and Innovations Director. I've been with the organization for about 3 years, and I know that's a really long title to say pretty much I write policies and make sure all of things get checked and all the paperwork gets done. But prior to FAI, I was the Executive Director for the Native Village of Afognak for 15 years. So I have a pretty deep history in working with tribal governments. I'm very passionate about our tribes and their success. So that's one of the reasons why I'm at the front of the room today. We are fill-ins. We are not your actual hosts today. You will have the pleasure here shortly of getting to meet Liz Medicine Crow Laganai, our president and CEO, and Mahlogadak, Barbara Blake, who is our Alaska Native Policy Center director. They're your actual hosts, but Juneau didn't want to let them free last night. Fog settled in and the plane flew over Juneau and made its way to Anchorage. So they hopped on a plane this morning. They'll be here any minute. So we're going to get them kicked off and kind of start digging into some of the content. They'll finish off the content, open it up for questions, and have discussion for our short time we have with you today.
Okay. Awesome, thank you. So if you've been to a gathering that First Alaskans has done before, hi Maktoya, good to see you. You will have seen these before. These are First Alaskans Institute agreements. We use them everywhere, even with ourselves when we're just hosting ourselves. This is just our way of putting some of our Indigenous values into practice around how we come together and have conversations with each other. It's helpful for us, we found, if we're all on the same page. We're not going to speak to all of them today, though we do invite them all into the space. I'm just going to pick two, and then Sheila Kanatinichkak will as well. So Today, we invite you all to speak to be understood and listen to understand. So we'll be doing the majority of speaking, and then when our other two hosts come, but you all hopefully will have a chance to ask questions as well. If you have a chance to do this longer training, we usually do this in a full day or broken over 2 days, a much longer extended session. Then we weave in time for breakouts. But essentially, we just invite you all to help others understand your lived experiences and your perspectives. You know, maybe when you're asking your question, that looks like sharing context or background to help others understand your train of thought. And then really listen to what others are sharing, to what your hosts will be sharing and our other hosts who will be joining us soon. Because we so often engage these days in a space of, I'm not calling out anyone in the room, but just nationally, we live in a very polarized time. And we so often don't engage in this way of trying to understand somebody else's perspective when it differs from ours. So just inviting you all to do that today. We also ask that you help make this a safe space for meaningful conversation. So some of you may know others in the room. And when we do these dialogues, we like to ask you all, and we abide by this ourselves, to protect what is said here in this space. So if one of your colleagues asks a question, whatever that question may be, or makes a comment, we just ask that you keep it in this space. Don't say, oh, Shilukanatanishkak asked this question at today's session. Unless they said something that was really insightful, that you thought was really powerful, is worth sharing in another space, then maybe just check in with them. Make sure that they're okay with you bringing it up in another space. And we will be doing the same as well today. And you're going to speak to it.
Yeah, I'm going to bring in, we are responsible for our experience. You know, typically this one, in a logical way, you look at it and you say, you get out of something what you put into it. We bring this one into the room because if you're somebody who tends to dominate the conversation, make space for others as well. You know, make this an enriching dialogue and conversation and engaging for everyone that's in the room. And then I'm going to bring up challenges to solutions. This is kind of one of our standards that we bring up in every discussion. In every industry and job that we're doing and in every role in our lives, we face challenges. And it's really important to bring voice to those challenges, share them with your colleagues, talk through them, but we don't want you to live in that space. It's more important to think solution-minded. So we bring this one up because we will always talk about the challenges. We will always give our people the opportunity to get the mic and talk about what's on their heart, but we want to move through those challenges and figure out how we can solve them. Do those sound like good agreements? Can we ask you guys to help us uphold them today? We're not the agreement police, so you know, we're not going to shake our fingers at you.
Yep. Okay, so we're going to get started. I will say that some of this might be information that you're familiar with already, depending on how much experience you have in Alaska, working within Alaska Native communities. We assume that there's sort of a spectrum of people in the room. But our hope is that a lot of the information that we share can either add more nuance to something you might have already encountered before, or maybe we'll discuss topics that are new to you in general, and that's also good. So what do all Alaskans need to know about Alaska Native communities? I think at a baseline, it's really important to understand that we have a deep relationship with this place. Sometimes this is lost because in our school systems in Alaska, we don't adequately teach to this history yet. I think we are getting there and we're moving in that direction. But we really do have thousands of years of ancestral connections to these places. And what that means and what that looks like is, you know, different for each region, but it always looks like having an intimate understanding of the land, the weather, how things are supposed to be. Every little place has a name traditionally. And embedded within those names is a lot of knowledge. I always think about, you know, when I learned that the area in Anchorage called Earthquake Park in Dena'ina, I wish I remembered the name of it, translates to rotten land. So, you know, if we had paid attention to the Dena'ina place names for this area, that would have clued us in to the fact that that area was, really sensitive to seismic activity. So those are that's the kind of knowledge that is embedded within our communities, within our languages, because of so many years of connection to this place. One way to think of it is geographic intelligence or traditional ecological knowledge. One thing we always ask people to remember is, and this again may be obvious to all of you all, but you'd be surprised how many people we encounter that also don't realize this, that Alaska Native communities are diverse. We are not a monolith by any means. And this is because our land is diverse. You know, how can a community that's based in a rainforest in Southeast Alaska be the same as a community that was born and nurtured and shaped along the coast? The land itself is what shapes us and makes us different from each other. So we do have a lot of similar values, but we are not the same. And it's important to remember that in the work that you all are doing. Oh. So this is a nifty little map. How many of you have seen something like this about the Alaska Native languages? Okay, so cool. Awesome. Most of you in the room then. I think it's really great I'm interested in languages, and seeing the relationship between our different language groups is really cool to me. So you can see the blue that kind of goes up and along the coast. It also really extends, if we had an international map, which I think we will shortly, you'll also see that our languages really connect to languages in Russia, and also in Canada and Greenland, especially the languages in the blue, the Inuit language group. And then you can see that all the Dene languages in the green, they have relationships with each other. They're distinct. An Otna speaker can't understand a Gwich'in speaker, at least to my knowledge. In the same way, my mother, who is an Inupiaq speaker, cannot understand a Sugpiaq speaker or a Yupik speaker. Although I think a Sugpiaq and Yupik speaker could understand a couple of things from each other, many words. So there are some linguistic similarities and differences between our groups, and it's important to remember that. You'll also see in another map that the Dene language group we have up here in Alaska is similar to, and is linguistically similar to some of the Dene languages in the lower 48. Tlingit is a unique branch of the Dene language group. It's distinct. Something to remember is that in Southeast, the language groups there, Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian, they're not all the same, and they don't all belong to the same language family. In fact, Haida is a completely distinct language from Tlingit. It's not in the Dene language branch at all, and neither is Tsimshian, and they're also distinct from each other. Next slide. Yeah.
I've never seen a consistent before like that. Does that mean, like, I know in you back then? Oh, yeah. Yep. I'm totally happy to do that. Hi. I've never seen this map presented like this before. Is that because I know Inupiaq and Yupik are, related? So is that showing the cultural family of Inuit languages? So if you go back one more. Yeah, and so then the green one. Oh, I see. Sorry.
Language groupings.
Sorry. I was just really interested in that map.
It is a relatively new map. It is a new map.
No, you're right on the money. So this is sort of another breakdown of those languages. So you can see on the left, you have the sort of Aleut, Inuit, Yupik languages kind of grouped together. Unangach or Unangan is a more distinct branch, more I would say more distinct than Sugpiaq, Yupik, Inupiaq, and Siberian Yupik. For example, like the structure of the language and the sounds built in Unangach are going to differ more greatly to Inupiaq, for example, than Inupiaq and Yupik would. And then you can see Tsimshian and Haida, they're in their own separate categories, again, in relation to what I was just sharing, that they are considered kind of within their own linguistic group totally, and they don't have other related languages that present-day linguists anyway have been able to find. And then on the right-hand side, you can see all of these Dene languages are connected, and you can see that Tlingit on the top has its on its own little branch, because while it's within the Dene language family, it's more distinct. Next slide. So that is a little bit about Alaska linguistically. If you get the chance to learn about our languages, I highly recommend that you do so. Learn how to introduce yourself in the language of the people on whose lands that you're on. That's something that I'm still working on. And it's just fun. You know, these are languages that don't exist anywhere else in the world. So something that I think is also important for people to understand is the difference in worldview that our people bring to our relationship with the land. And again, this is something that I would assume most of you have encountered or are familiar with at this point, is that, you know, from a Western worldview, we often think of land as something that can be owned or as something that contains resources that can be used. And that has its lineage all the way tracing back to sort of Western philosophy and concepts around, you know, economics, Western economics, all of that stuff. If you really want to get academic about it, you can kind of trace the lineage there. But essentially what we mean to point out is just that we don't have the same necessarily relationships with our homelands that you might think of, or that, and because of that, relating to our homelands, the way that we think about management, co-stewardship, all of those things might not necessarily be the same as somebody who's approaching this from maybe a federal agency standpoint, a state agency standpoint, or even other researchers. You can see that a huge percentage of Alaska is owned by the federal government, about a quarter of it or slightly less is state-owned. And then you see this graphic is pointing out that 10% of land is native-owned. That actually is the same category as private land, so it really should be the same color. You see the private category is orange. Native land, almost all native land in Alaska is privately owned land. We'll get into the complexities, or perhaps our other hosts will get into the complexities of land ownership and all of that stuff a little bit later. So this is just, this is the other map that I was referencing earlier. I won't spend too much time on it, but you can see the blue language grouping there. This actually highlights in Russia, you can see a little bit of blue there that shows the connection of those languages to our languages here in Alaska. You can see that it travels up into Canada. If you look in this thumbprint here, you can see the blue that extends all the way over to Canada and Greenland, shows the linguistic relationships there with our, what did they call it? Aleut Inuit language grouping. And then you can see the red in the thumbnail, how it extends down into Canada and also is connected to, you know, little spots of red down in the lower 48. And I just think that is fascinating to learn about those relationships there. Next slide. Okay, so we are going to talk a little bit now about sovereignty.
Yeah, good times. So one of the things that we like to really call out and discuss as in depth as we possibly can during these trainings is the difference between our political and our racial status. As Indigenous people in the United States, we have both. And they tend to be conflated really, really easily when you're working with Indigenous people. Indigenous governments predate the US Constitution. And as a result, we have a very well-defined and distinct government-to-government relationship with the federal government. So that's what we talk about when we talk about the political status. Our racial status is really about civil rights, affirmative action, minority grouping. So there are areas within working with Indigenous people that we fall into that racial status, like all other minority groups do. But when you're talking about our government-to-government status, which is the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is our Indian Health Service, our medical, the sovereignty that our tribes have and hopefully are asserting throughout the country, that all falls within our political status. It's a protected right that our Indigenous people have. So one example, if you're paying attention to what's kind of happening nationally in the news, and actually has been around now for, I think we've been litigating the Brackeen versus Department of Interior lawsuit for close to 5 years now. That's the Indian Child Welfare Act. It's just now being heard again in the Supreme Court. It's being called out as a racially based law. And that's what brought it into the Texas courts originally, was a white family wanted to adopt actually a Tlingit child. And because of ICWA, the tribe got involved and it was going towards looking at family adoption. They took it to court saying it was a racially based law, it was discrimination against them. ICWA was in place because, well, number one, it became a law because too many of our Indigenous children were being adopted out and stripped of their culture. And we had no control over that. It was outside of our, as Indigenous people and tribes, control. So ICWA became a law so that tribes could be full parties to those cases. Anytime an Indian child gets taken into state's custody, the tribe has the opportunity. And there are many thresholds that have to be met within the Indian child welfare law. So it's now up in the Supreme Court. It's extremely dangerous when our laws get heard at the Supreme Court level. Most of the time we would say, the Supreme Court's going to uphold sovereignty, we're all good. But we all know, based on the political climate that's been happening over the last several months, that that's not the case right now. So we are watching that litigation very, very carefully, because if that goes away, it puts everything else in jeopardy. All of the other federal Indian law that guides the work that we as Indigenous people do. And we'll get into more detail of that in a few minutes. So I'm not sure if you guys have ever seen this map. I love this map. Like I said, I'm a tribal advocate, very, very passionate about our tribes. Alaska has 229 federally recognized tribes. There are 574 in the country. So we make up almost half of the federally recognized tribes in the country. Ours are predominantly pretty small. And some of them work together really, really well, and some of them don't work together really, really well. They are independent organizations, independent communities. Some regions have many, some regions have only a few. Like I said, I'm from Kodiak, so here's my beautiful island and archipelago. We have 10 federally recognized tribes in the Kodiak region, and 3 of them reside within the city of Kodiak. The Shunak tribe, which is traditionally the Kodiak people, that's what Shunak translates to. So they are the largest tribe of the island, and they're what we would consider more of an urban-based tribe. Afognak and Taniknak, or Woody Island, are displaced tribes. Afognak was destroyed in the '64 earthquake, and so it sort of disbanded and created what is now Port Lions. But they're independent tribes. They're both federally recognized. They both sometimes service the same people, sometimes different people, because people will tend to be citizens of a tribe where they feel the most calling of. Yes.
So recently the state of Alaska recognized all the federal tribes, is that true?
I'm not going to use the word recognized. Strategically, they acknowledged that sovereign tribes exist in Alaska, and they codified it, which is very important. Yep, I'll absolutely tell you what that means. So our relationship with the state government has been very hot and cold, depending on which administration is in there. And tribal sovereignty, so our tribes in Alaska they gained their federal recognition in the early to mid 90s when Ada Deer was the Assistant Secretary of Interior. There was a big push at that time to make sure that all of our tribes also had gained that federal recognition. She basically took a list of villages in the state of Alaska and gave them federal recognition, which is why you'll see Afognak and Port Lions, both are independent tribes because they were independently listed on the village list. Shunak was not a village because they reside more in what we consider our city. So they weren't on the list. So they ended up having to fight for their recognition, which they gained in 1998. So you'll see some differences like that throughout the state, where it's not unique to Kodiak. There are other displaced tribes. We also have a collection, I don't know how many, I don't know what the number is, but we actually have unfederally recognized tribes in the state of Alaska. They don't necessarily have the same government-to-government relationship with the federal government. They don't qualify for the set-aside funding that our tribes that are federally recognized get, but they still do some of the same services, and most of them are seeking recognition. So what happened recently, we've seen iterations throughout our state government of attempts to get Alaska State to recognize and or acknowledge that sovereign governments exist, and that the relationship between the state government should be one of governments talking to each other. And it hasn't been that way. Governor Knowles attempted with the Millennium Agreement years ago, which really had no teeth behind it and disappeared after he left his administration. Governor Walker attempted through a legal definition of tribes that had a little more teeth, but until it was actually codified in Alaska state law, they didn't really have to follow any of that. So that's what happened most recently. It's not that the state of Alaska recognized or gave sovereignty to our tribes, because they already had it. They acknowledged that it existed, and they acknowledge now in law that a relationship needs to exist. So now what comes after that, we'll see, because we're in the middle of an election, and we're not entirely sure what's going to happen with the administration. I don't live in Alaska now, so I think it's still undecided. I'm trying to follow along with Alaska politics. So we'll see, but at least it's codified. That is huge. And many states throughout the country have similar laws that are already codified. They have entire departments in their state governments that are dedicated to working with their tribes. So Alaska has been behind the 8 ball for a long, long time. I could spend hours on this slide, and we don't have hours. So I'm going to try to move us along. And just so you know, you will have an opportunity to ask questions when the other 2 hosts come. We did build that into the time together. So there are always, yeah. As long as I think we're doing pretty good on time. So there's always 3 sovereigns operating in the state of Alaska at the same time. And as Indigenous people, we're citizens of all of these. So that's something that we manage and we're comfortable with, because it's our world. But when you're working with all of us, oftentimes people look at the 3 sovereigns as something that's a deficit. We don't view it that way. We see it as an opportunity for abundance. These are opportunities that are afforded to all of the people that live within the state of Alaska. And when we have the opportunity to all sit at the table together, we can make decisions that impact all Alaskans in a better way. What's good for Alaska Natives is also good for all Alaskans. That's the premise that First Alaskans Institute works from, and it's the forefront of all of the work that we do. So when we can all sit at the table together, and we've seen little tiny areas throughout the state where this happens, it doesn't happen enough. So it's something that we're working for. Alaska Natives make up almost 22% of the population. That's not how we're represented right now across decision-making bodies. So anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, just on the percentage point there, sometimes you'll see people say that Alaska Natives are 16% of the population. If you see that figure, it's incorrect, because that number drawn from the census, from the 2020 census, excludes anybody who marked on their census form that they're Alaska Native and another race. So if you quote the 16% figure, it leaves out almost everyone at First Alaskans, for example, because I'm Alaska Native, and I didn't say this earlier, but you might have picked it up from my intro. My dad is not Alaska Native, he's from Pakistan, actually. So on my census, I think I checked, I'm Alaska Native and also South Asian. So if you quote the 16% figure, you're leaving me out, you're leaving out, tons of people that have a mixed background but are still Alaska Native. So make sure that you use the right number. We're 22% of the population. I would also say that, one sec. I would also add that, I think there's a lot of great work that we could do. Speaking from the point that you made about the collaboration between our governments, if we could have a better working relationship with the state of Alaska, and that's a huge part of why that state recognition acknowledgement is important, because historically the state of Alaska has sued Alaska tribes more than any other state in the country, which is mind-blowing when you think about how young the state of Alaska is compared to other states, especially states on the East Coast. So that gives you an indicator of how contentious things have been for a really long time. We've had, at one point it wasn't even okay to say the word tribe in the state legislature, because that's just the climate that we have been in for a really long time. So getting to a point where we can say, all right, it benefits our shared citizenry if we can work together, will be a really great thing, and especially when it comes to battling things like climate change, addressing those issues.
I'll just expand on that one point, and then I'll turn it back over to you. Oh, I'm sorry, you had a question.
I would love to use that statistic. Yeah, sorry, I should probably stand up too, but in order to use that statistic, I need a citation. Where can we find that? Because you're right, I always have 16 or 17% in my head, and I know where to cite that, but I don't know where to cite 22.
I actually just did it the other day. I had to find it for myself because she was busy and I needed it for a grant and I couldn't remember the exact of it. There is a clickable page where you can choose different things, and there was one choice that included both of those. So it was Alaska Natives and combined races. And so I clicked on that button and I got the percentage. Yeah, in there, it's like this, I think I Googled Alaska Native census statistics, and I came up with several pages, and one of them, you could drill down into those things, and it was an option. Yeah.
It's the Alaska Natives alone or in combination number, to use their census lingo.
This is why I was trying to get a hold of her, because she knows the data way better than I do. So the other point that I was going to make was when Walker came into administration, he had wanted to better relations with tribes in Alaska. He had made a concerted effort for that in his first year in administration, and he created the Governor's Tribal Advisory Council. And like Kunmagu said, at that point in time, the state of Alaska had not only sued tribes more than any other state, but any other state combined. Alaska state government has sued our tribes. So I was a part of the Governor's Tribal Advisory Council. And that very first meeting, we were like, quit suing us. We all sat around the table with our tribal leaders, Governor Walker, Lieutenant Governor Malott, and his entire cabinet. And he said, what's the first thing you want us to, as a state government, to do? Quit suing us. That was the first thing. Get rid of every single lawsuit you have right now. And by the time he ended his administration, every lawsuit was gone. Not the case right now, but it was at the time. We made some progress. So we're hoping to make more progress. You ready?
Yes. So just to recap the last session, if you could help others remember that we have a distinct political status along with that racial status that we mentioned, that would go a long way to helping just kind of ease some of the difficulties of when people start working with Native communities for the first time, because I think that is one of the biggest areas of misunderstanding. Sometimes what this leads to is, for example, everything from snide comments about, oh, you get free this and that, when it's not free. It's the rent that the United States pays to, live here as a country. But, if you really drill down into federal Indian law, there is a really robust, what's the word? Record of why the federal Indian law, why federal Indian law exists, and what the federal trust responsibility is, which we'll get to in a second. But having you all help others understand that we have a distinct government-to-government relationship with the federal government, that really stems from us having operated our own unique governing systems, way prior to when the United States ever came into existence would help a lot. Yeah, so I'll just end that last section with that kind of call for your help with that. And then we're going to talk a little bit now about our organizations. I forgot to say before we started this session that we actually created what is this governance and protocols training actually when Governor Walker came into office, because as part of his commitment to resetting the relationship with our communities, there was recognition that, you know, nowhere in Alaska do you really have the opportunity to learn some of the essentials about Native communities, and also from a governance, policy, and law perspective, unless you've had the privilege of, you know, studying that in your undergraduate or graduate days. So we put together this training as a result of those conversations, and we actually trained up Governor Walker's cabinet and many in his staff and in his team, and that was the birth of this. And we've since gone on to kind of share it with many others, again out of recognition that, you know, we don't all have the chance or the opportunity to learn these things, and, you know, anyone who's working in Alaska with Alaska Native communities should have this basis of information so that you can really do your best work. Otherwise, we're not setting people up for success if you don't have a background in this knowledge. So that's all to say that if you have questions, feel free to ask us. You can jot questions down on a piece of paper. We meant to have a little anonymous question bowl. Yeah, so you could, oh, go ahead.
There's also an app where you can ask things using the Q&A portion, and I'll make sure that we revisit those questions at the end. Yeah.
Okay, oh, that's right. I got an email about that. I totally forgot. Thank you for reminding us. The other thing I wanted to add about that is one of the hosts that'll be coming in later, Barbara Blake or Wathal Gadak, she actually taught this as a university level class. So the training that First Alaskans does is an iteration of her class, because clearly we don't have the time to do a semester with you. Her original slide deck was over 300 slides. Some of them were quite intimidating because there was a lot of words that in a really small font. So this is an extremely pared down version. We're not going to be able to cover anything close to everything within 2 hours. We do this training in either 9 hours virtually or 2 days in person. So you guys are getting a very, very, very small taste of it.
Yeah, it's the pebble on the tip of the iceberg, as she likes to say. Okay, so we're going to share a little bit about understanding the layers of our organizations. This is where we get a lot of questions because it just is confusing. And I'll just say, you know, as Native people, we don't come like just baked in with this knowledge too. So you may, you know, meet people who have a really in-depth understanding of this, way beyond mine or Sheila Kanatanichkak's understanding of it. But you also might meet people who have a really good understanding of one piece of it, but maybe not the entire ecosystem because it's complicated. So again, we have our tribal governments that we've been talking about before. We also, as I'm sure you all are aware, we have our Alaska Native corporations that operate at both a regional level and our village corporation level. We'll go into that in more detail. Feel free to ask questions about any of these entities. We also have this, have these regional nonprofits. Oh, maybe I'll scoot a little bit over this way. We have regional nonprofits that in many cases operate in unique relationships with our tribes. So it's easier to share an example. So for example, the Tanana Chiefs Conference is a regional nonprofit who acts on behalf of the tribes in the region for the provision of certain services like healthcare, other things like that. So they get their line of authority, if you want to think of it like that, derives from the tribes in their region. And every year, the tribal leadership meets and sets the priorities of what TCC should be working on. And at any point, so the tribes within the TCC region, they also bring their federal dollars for different things like healthcare, other services to bear. And TCC pools all of those dollars together to deliver services to the region. At any point, a tribe, and you could fill in any gaps that I might leave out, but at any point, if a particular tribe is unsatisfied with the services or for whatever reason, they have the right to withdraw from that regional nonprofit and also take their resources with them. So every regional nonprofit is set up differently from region to region, again, because it depends on what the directives the tribes within the region are giving them. So you have the Arctic Slope Native Association, you have the Tanana Chiefs Conference, you have CANA, the Kodiak Area Native Association, you have, I think you have one for every region, plus a couple of statewide ones. Yeah. So we've got a list that is coming up in a little bit. And we have other Alaska Native entities as well. We have the Alaska Federation of Natives, which is a unique body that actually was born out of our advocacy in the 60s and 70s for our the land claims movement. You have First Alaskans Institute. We're not directly tied to any particular tribe. We're a statewide Native organization. We're also not connected to any particular Native corporation, but you also have cultural heritage organizations as well, other kinds of Native entities like that.
Housing authorities that derive a lot of their funding through Indian self-determination funding. You have, in Kodiak, we have the Alutiiq Museum. There are education foundations in almost every region. So there are many other Alaska Native organizations that are Native serving, but not necessarily directly tied to some of these other organizations.
I was under the impression that the nonprofits were somehow funded or tied to the Native corporations. Is that completely wrong?
Completely wrong. Great question. I think we're going to go into that in a little more detail, but basically the Alaska Native corporations came to life from the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. They are state chartered for-profit corporations, but they're not like completely, because they're tied to ANCSA, they have some rules within that law that they have to follow, and that's why they have shareholders. They're not publicly traded companies, things like that, so they can't just be a standard for-profit corporation. Our nonprofits are completely independent. Majority of them get their funding from the Indian Health Service if they operate a health arm, which most of them do, but not all. They also get their funding from the Department of Interior, Department of Justice, all of those federal departments that have a Native specific funding typically goes through our nonprofits and can also go through the tribes. So there are 501c3, state chartered 501c3 nonprofits that expressly serve Indian people. I'm warm, just so you guys know.
Real quick, yeah, no kidding. Well, you may be going to address this, but at least in some areas, there's actually layers of tribes. So for example, on the North Slope, you have the Inupiaq Community of the Arctic Slope, which is a regional tribal organization. And then each village pretty much has its own tribal organization. So for example, the Native Village of Barrow, Inutqiagvik, et cetera. So I don't know, maybe you're going to go into that. The other thing I would possibly address is, at least in some areas, again, the North Slope being probably the prime example, it's technically a municipal government of the state of Alaska, but it's very much, it's almost completely run by Inupiaq people. But those are, if you're going to be doing something on land, you may need to be getting permits, so they need to be factored in here too. So I don't know, maybe you're going to go into that. It just makes it worse, I know.
It makes it extremely complex. We do like to say that Alaska Natives were #it's complicated before hashtags were a thing. We're going to do our best to cover all of those things, but like I said, we only have 2 hours with you. And those are the other complex pieces of it.
Yeah, so we actually have 2 regional tribes in Alaska. We've got the Inupiaq Community of the Arctic Slope, as you mentioned, ICAS. We also have the Central Council of Tlingit and Haida Indian Tribes of Alaska, or Tlingit and Haida for short, in Southeast. Those are the 2 main tribes that sort of operate on a regional level. It's very important to remember that they do not speak for the entire region what I mean to say is, don't assume that they somehow operate on a hierarchy where they are more important than any of the individual local tribes, because that is sometimes is an assumption that people accidentally make, and they'll tend to only outreach to ICAS or only outreach to Tlingit and Haida and then ignore the other tribes individually, and that is a recipe for building bad relationships with communities. So if you're working in a specific community, I'll just say, you mentioned Utqagavik. If you're working in Utqagavik, you should also reach out to the native village of Barrow. Don't only reach out to ICAS, even though ICAS covers the entire region. If you're working in Sitka, you should also reach out to the Sitka tribe of Alaska. You shouldn't just go through the Central Council of Tlingit and Haida. So that's what I mean. You also mentioned municipal governments. That is another layer to all of this, right? Because we only brought up the native serving institutions a second ago, but there are also going to be boroughs in some of the communities that you'll be working within. The North Slope Borough, for example, is one of those that is significant and you have to engage with on the North Slope. But there are communities that don't have a borough, but they might have another, a city government. And the dynamics within those regions can differ. So, for example, there are some regions where it's primarily a non-native part of the community that operates the city government, and it's primarily, and then the indigenous leadership is primarily within the tribe or on the tribal council. So you may see more kind of clashing and those entities going head to head in situations where that is the case. Not every case though. It's not like that in every community, I mean. But you'll also see dynamics like I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but the woman who just asked the question. Okay, thank you. Yes, so you also brought up that on the North Slope, the borough there is predominantly run by our Inupiat people. So in that instance, that creates a different dynamic than, you don't necessarily see, you'll see a different dynamic on the North Slope than you would in a community where it was a split between non-natives and native communities on the different sides of those governmental bodies. But what we like to emphasize is that all of these organizations are serving within their regions the same people. And so it's important, it's incumbent upon all of these different layers to understand, each of their roles, to work well together. Different communities are doing that in different ways. I mentioned Sitka, the Sitka Tribe of Alaska, and the city, or the municipal body in Sitka. They have regularly, they have two meetings every year, if not more, where they come together and make sure that they're on the same page around legislative priorities that they want to make sure they're mutually advocating for, that they're not stepping on each other's toes, that they're working well together. So they actually have an MOA in place for that. And I would love to see more and more of our organizations moving in that direction, because ultimately we are caring for the same people. And the more we can, like we were saying earlier, link arms and kind of unite our efforts, the better it is for all Alaskans. So next slide. There are a couple of ways to strengthen the relationship you have with Alaska Native communities, and it depends on, it really depends on the entity or the individual. So for example, consultation, that's mainly going to happen from a government to government. In a government to government capacity, the federal government already has a responsibility to consult with tribes in a particular region, although how that consultation plays out is up to each agency to develop. So you still see that consultation process taking place on a spectrum. But that, when it's done really well, can ensure that our communities have built in from the very beginning, our voice is woven in from the very beginning if consultation is done well. Another way to engage with Native communities to kind of strengthen that working relationship is through the process of compacting. Again, this is something that mostly happens on a government to government basis, but the process of compacting is how the Alaska Native Tribal healthcare system has come into being, the system that we have today. It is a result of a government-to-government sort of partnership between many of our tribes in Alaska and the federal government. So what is a compact? How many of you have heard of this word before? I have some people. So compact is it's very important to remember that a compact is very, very different from a contract, which is the third bullet that we have there. Contracts, I think, are something that all of us are familiar with. It essentially establishes a relationship where, the contractor is fulfilling whatever terms are written out in a contract. And that contract is, spelling out usually, exactly how the work should be done, what the deliverables should be at the end. Usually, I'm thinking of a standard contract. In that kind of scenario, the contractor doesn't have a whole lot of wiggle room to decide on the ground what, to make a change if something needs to be done differently. Maybe they'll have to have a conversation with the contractee first, that kind of thing. In a compacting scenario, in contrast, that really is an agreement between two government bodies on equal footing with each other. So essentially, when you have a compact, it's a government-to-government partnership where the governments are negotiating the terms of that compact, if it's around the provision of a certain service like healthcare, the two governments are negotiating, okay, this is what you're going to be in charge of, this is what I'm going to be in charge of. That is all an open conversation that happens between the two of them. It's not just set forth by one body in sort of a hierarchical manner. If you, again, using the healthcare example, part of that negotiation would also be what are the resources that are going to flow from one government to another government, from the federal government in this case to our Alaska tribes. What's the funding that's going to flow? Maybe the support in terms of human resources. All of that stuff is part of that annual. It actually is an annual negotiation. So the Alaska Native Health Board is what leads that negotiation annually with the federal government. Not every single tribe in Alaska is party to that compact, but many are. And so their federal health dollars flow into the Alaska Native tribal health system. That began in almost 30 years ago, 1994. And since we've seen that essentially kind of a handover to our tribes have been able to make the changes that they need to make within our healthcare system to drastically improve health outcomes for our communities. Is our healthcare system perfect? No, we still have room for growth. But if you compare it to 50 years ago when the Indian Health Service, or any time prior to 1994 when the Indian Health Service was providing care to our communities, it's just worlds better. And what's the metric? I can't think of it. I'm expecting you to read my mind. Excuse me. What I meant to say is, even if you look at health metrics like how long your life expectancy. That's what I was trying to get at. Even if you look at things like life expectancy, that has changed drastically since the Alaska Native Healthcare Compact came into being about 28 years ago. So that is a really great way to improve relationships with our communities. We are, the state of Alaska is a lot newer to compacting as a process than the federal government is. In 2017, we signed the Alaska Tribal Child Welfare Compact. That was between the state of Alaska and some tribes here in Alaska at the time. And that was, again, a government-to-government agreement that was designed to streamline and improve the child welfare process within the state. And you could speak to that a lot more than I could. If you want to, I'll pass you the mic. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a few different things going around in my head at the moment, but essentially the Child Welfare Compact, first of all, first one in the country. to ever be designed the way it was. So that is a huge feat that came from the advocacy of Commissioner Val Davidson at the time, who was one of our Alaska Native leaders, now the president of the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium. And the state was failing us. Alaska Native children had the highest percentage of being taken into state's custody and staying in foster care. And nothing was changing. After years and years and years and years of us, that number just kept creeping up and creeping up and creeping up. So clearly the state was failing in that. And that was really the premise for why we needed a child welfare. What are the statistics today? I'm not 100% sure, because as administrations have changed, we had to refight the battle of the need for the Child Welfare Compact, which did set things back a little bit. So it didn't go away, thankfully, but we had to re-argue some of those same things that we had to do in the Walker administration. We had to do it again in Dunleavy's administration. Whereas a compact like you see with our Indian Health Service dollars, the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, it's been around now for 30 years. We've gotten through some of those initial arguments and trying to seat things a proper way and ensure that our Alaska Native tribes maintain that autonomy to decide our health care. So even though we have the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, each region still maintains its own autonomy to do what's best for their people. So you'll see services in the Kodiak region, they're vastly different than the North Slope region because our needs are different, our ecosystems are different, our people are essentially a little different. And then I wanted to go back to the question about the corporations and the nonprofits that you asked, I said you were completely wrong. We might be talking about two different nonprofits. And so I wanted to make sure and cover that. Education foundations do come from the corporations. Regional nonprofits do not, if that makes sense. Okay.
So ANCSA did not create, I know, I keep doing this. You guys are going to hate me.
There's
by the
all
end of
these
this.
people on Zoom.
I know. I was one of them yesterday. So ANCSA did not create like YKHC, Manilik. There was not, okay. So it was just the for-profit corporations and educational foundations.
Well, ANCSA created the Thank you. Thank you. ANCSA created the for-profit corporations and the village corporations, and it was also around that time that the birth of the nonprofits came about, which is why it gets conflated a lot.
Yeah, it's complicated for sure. So no, I appreciate you asking these questions because if you're wondering, other people in the room are wondering, and we do get these questions often. So that's why we're here, is so that you all can ask. So contracting, just to complete the slide, contracting is, as we all know, it's a very different kind of dynamic. It's more hierarchical. You have somebody kind of telling you how the work needs to get done. And compacting is by and large our preference because it really gives tribes on the ground the wiggle room to decide how best to deliver a certain service. It's the communities that are there, the people that are part of that community that really know best what the needs are. So that's what compacting allows you to do. It gives the tribes that flexibility to make those changes. Yes.
Perhaps you're going to get into this, but to bring this to a very practical level for some people in the room, say you are a researcher at an institution, a university that already has its ways of working, and you are perhaps concocting an NNA grant proposal with an IRA. What are your suggestions? Contracting, we know how to do that. Presumably we could both be applying for the grant as organizations, and that would be more like compacting, right? Does anybody have suggestions? I mean, obviously you ask the IRA how they want to engage with you in this activity.
Yeah, so it's a good question, and we really want to talk about this. So an IRA is another term for a tribe, but it specifically refers to a tribe that incorporated under the Indian Reorganization Act. hence IRA. But not all tribes in Alaska are IRA tribes, meaning not all tribes in Alaska incorporated under that act in terms of their modern day form of what we now refer to as the tribal entities that we have, the 229 tribal entities that we have. About a third of them, I want to say, are tribes that formed under that Indian Reorganization Act. But a lot of other tribes haven't. Oh, hey, Lagunai is here. Wonderful, wonderful, one of our hosts. But no, so that's what that is referring to. But to get to your question, it is really important as you're thinking about all the different layers of organizations that we just went through. We've got the tribes, we've got our corporations, we've got our regional nonprofits, and we've got, all of the different things we mentioned, that you're doing your due diligence to outreach to as many of those entities as possible. So for example, Walthalgidot can tell the story when she comes, but she used to work with the Indian Agricultural Council. Of course, now that I have to tell you all, I get the name wrong. She used to work in the Department of Agriculture. And at one point, just as I said, every federal agency gets to shape their consultation process. So the Department of Agriculture actually had a consultation on what should consulting look like. And one of the big takeaways that they had in that experience was, and one of the resounding messages that they heard from people was, invite all of us, if you're working within our region. If it pertains to us, we'll come. If it doesn't pertain to us, we won't come, because our tribal leaders, our community leaders, they usually are wearing many, many hats. Sometimes the same person will be on the village corporation board or the regional corporation board, and will also be on the tribal council, and may also be in the city government. They may be wearing many, many different hats, or they may serve in the educational foundation or in the regional nonprofit. So our leaders are getting tapped constantly. They're getting hundreds of emails in their inboxes. So doing your due diligence to outreach to them, to all of them, and just say, hey, I'm doing this work, I have this potential grant, et cetera. I would love to talk about, like, what are the priorities, what are your community priorities, and begin that relationship is really important. Sometimes you don't always know who are the right entities to outreach to, and it's okay to say that, but it's okay to, so that's why the rule of being inclusive and inviting everybody, and if it pertains to people, they'll come, is a good kind of rule of thumb to go by. Do you have anything you want to speak to that?
Other things to speak to too. Yes. The only thing that I would add is, even as a statewide Native organization, we do the same thing. I really wish there was this little silver bullet I could give you all and say, oh, if you want to talk to all the Native people in Alaska, here's how you do it. Yeah, no, we contact every single tribe, we contact every corporation, we contact every regional nonprofit. It is time consuming. But if you want to truly build a meaningful relationship with Alaska's Native people, that's how you do it. Period. We're done. No.
Could I give a piece of advice to answer that question? My name's Laura Eichelberger. I'm an anthropologist, and I work for ANTHC. So we're neighbors. And one of the things that we always try to do is contact the city and the tribe, because you never know. I mean, the city often has lots of community members on it as well, and sometimes it's speaking to the conflict issue. Like sometimes, a city will be predominantly of one family and the tribe will be predominantly of the other. And if you want to work with a community, you really gotta, reach out to everybody. I find it useful to, if I am able to go in person, but if not, do it remotely, attend one of their council meetings, because active community members will come and listen. Often elders are there, and that's a good place for people to come and listen and think and go back to their families, go back to their friends and talk about it. And that whole process of just becoming more of a visible person and a friend, it's really about establishing relationships, and that takes time. And just showing up and presenting yourself and not expecting anything on that first visit other than maybe, some shaking hands and maybe some seal oil. Maybe you'll get lucky and get invited over to somebody's house. Thanks.
Which, if you do, take that invitation. Always, always. Our Native people really despise it when you fly into a community. Hey, we're going to do our business and we're going to leave. See you later. Horrible way to build relationships with our people. Horrible. So there's my, I'm on my soapbox now. Transition really, really quickly. We are not going to take a break. I heard it was actually built into your agenda, but we have used it for such a short time. We've told you that a couple of times. So we're just going to power through. But if you need to use the restroom, get some coffee, please do that. Our president and CEO just joined us, Liz Medicine Crow. I will let her introduce herself, but she said we're on a good roll. So she's going to let us keep the microphone and she's going to chime in when she wants. And I know she will because she's good at that.
Not really. I'm so bashful and quiet. Sangait la utlang, everyone. Good to see you all. I'm so glad that they were willing to jump in for us because Fog Woman just laid down mysteriously on the wetlands in Juneau. Isn't that mysterious? Who would have thought to build an airport right there? Well, if only they had consulted with some natives from the area before they decided to do that. My name is Lagunai. I'm Haida and Tlingit. I come from Kikwan and Haida Gwaii, and also through Hikdahanlai, now known today as Heidelberg. And on my Haida side, I'm a Eagle Chichkitne, and on my Tlingit side, I'm Raven Kutch Uddy, freshwater mark sockeye salmon. And yeah, these two superheroes saved our lives this morning, so I'm so glad that they were already here, because she was in Kodiak. They have their own weather things. And then Watlagidak, who is the director of our policy center, she's still at the airport trying to wrestle her rental car from the company. Oh, nice.
Okay, so we're going to continue on with the content so we can get through it and get to some questions.
And I will say, you know, one of the things we hear often from our community leaders is sending an email is not enough. Okay, don't just send an email and hope that that gets through to people, because like I said, our community leaders are wearing so many hats. They're putting out a ton of fires at any one time. They're working miracles, usually on a shoestring budget, or especially our tribal leaders. And so, you know, they may not see your email if you send it to them. It might go to their spam. It might go, if you send it to the info@ email, they might not even get it. So, you know, really be determined with your outreach. Make sure that you're calling people. Make sure that you're reaching out. And if you can't reach people in the first phone call, keep trying. Try again in another hour. You know, try again the next day. Like, make sure that you really are speaking on the phone with somebody and saying, "Hey, you know, this is who I am. I really want to find the right time to come and share a little bit about this project. Maybe meet some people, see if we can create something that is really useful and beneficial to your community." And doing that at the very front end of your work and not just kind of coming in towards the end when you already have your project idea. Ideally, in a perfect world, is what you want to see, is what our community leaders want to see. That's not always possible. So coming in as early as you can or as quick as you can through that process, and just being cognizant of the fact that our communities, that when you're asking for our leadership's time, you're asking for their capacity, that you're being really considerate of the fact that they also have many other things that they need to handle within the community. So just, if you can't reach somebody the first go around, the first email you don't get a response to, keep trying, keep going, keep reaching out, because that responsibility really is on the researcher to establish that relationship.
Yeah, I want to add to that a little bit, because I sat in that chair for a long time. And so be determined, be patient, and don't take it personally. Because we really are, you know, I can't even tell you how many emails I would get a day. And some of them were for consultation. Oh, we want to come in your community. Some of them, because I was an A tribe and I was at the top of the alphabet list, I got questions for the entire region. You know, phone calls, emails, people stopping by. It is insane. I had a staff of 8. I was HR, finance director, IT, executive director. This is really, really common in our tribes. They do a million things. The ones that are in communities are actually also doing utilities and road maintenance and all of these things. So be patient with them if they don't answer you, and don't get your feelings hurt if they don't want to talk to you about your research project, because they have so many things. Our up north tribes are dealing with their villages sliding into the ocean. You know, they may not find value in your research project, and that's okay. Is there something you want to add?
So I just want to share a couple pro tips. When I'm hunting down one of our community members, and I want to have a conversation with them, I use Facebook Messenger, because guess where our community is? Yeah, that's where they are. If I send an email and then I send a follow-up email like a week later or 2 weeks later, then I send another one, just putting it at the top of your inbox email, then I'll go over to Facebook Messenger, find them, send them another message, and I usually get a response to one of the emails. So the reason that they're emphasizing that you should be determined and also approachable and patient is because we have a completely different time scale than everyone else. Our time scale is thousands of years old. And what feels urgent to you is something that they have been dealing with for a really long time. The other thing is to think about the way that you build a relationship. If you cold call someone, the likelihood of it really getting in there and being listened to and taken seriously is pretty low, because we don't trust researchers in our community. And that is a well-earned distrust. So how do you understand from where you're at how to actually build back stronger and better than what was done before? One of the ways that you could do it is by taking an area of interest that's not yours and pursuing a connection to the community that way. Go to their health symposiums. Go to their education symposiums. Go to the places that they are at to learn rather than to extract. And they will develop a personal, meaningful relationship with you. But if you only show up on their doorstep because it's convenient to you and about your agenda, are you really coming to be a good partner? So what other ways can you create relationship outside of the context of what just directly benefits you? That will go a long way in building meaningful connections and aligning research agendas. Because I can tell you what, they have really long research agendas. They just might not talk about it the way that you do, and they may do work around it differently than you might approach it. So this is also another way that you can be contributing up, being a contributing member to their community by bringing your skills and capacities in a way that is offering service as opposed to extracting relationship for your own benefit and then leaving. Because that's kind of the paradigm here now. That is the paradigm. So you, as people who are doing research and wanting to reset relationships, you do have a higher burden of effort now because of what predecessors have done and the legacy that they have left. Now you have to be a person who comes in to build and heal relationships with institutions, academia, research institutions, all of that. So those are things that you might not have signed up for. But if you're coming to our homelands and wanting to do research around our peoples, our homelands, our animals, all of it, then this is a really good pathway for how you build relationship in a meaningful way. And luckily, we're pretty lovable once you get to know us.
Yeah, some of those community gatherings are, I'm just thinking about some of the regional ones. You have the Chamai Festival that takes place in Bethel. You have Kiviak that happens in the North Slope. It's happening this February 1 through 4, I believe. That both of those are instances where communities get together for several days of ceremony, song, and dance, togetherness, feasting. They are just incredibly joyful times that are some of the moments that we look forward to the most. There's celebration. That's every other year in Southeast. Kiviak is every other year on the North Slope. I think Chamai is every year. Beaver Festival in Dillingham. Yeah, the trade fair in Kotzebue, Kutnut. Yep. Point Hope has their own particular version of the whaling celebration called Kaguruk. Nalukatuk happens in the other whaling communities on the North Slope. That's usually in the summertime. You have the Festival of Native Arts. You have the Elders and Youth Conference that First Alaskans Institute does. You have the Alaska Federation of Natives Conference, of course, convention. So you have all of these, and you've got the Sobriety Festival down in Cordova, the Tribal Providers Conference. So there are these big regional gatherings that are really great ways to really great places to start going to. And then as you hear about other gatherings that are more specific to the communities that you're engaging in, going to those as well. So I really appreciate you bringing that up, Magunai. So really there is no shortcut to building that relationship. And I'm glad that you acknowledged as well, Lagunai, that it really is healing relationships as well, because our communities, not only are they very busy, but not only are community leaders putting out many fires and also pulling miracles and doing a lot of really great work, but I really encourage you all to learn about some of the other, and we'll touch on this very briefly, but we don't have time to get very in-depth into it. I encourage you all to educate yourselves about the history of colonization in the state of Alaska, because that also is something that as Alaska Native people we're cognizant about. You don't want to be another accidental arm of colonization as you're coming in and engaging with communities. I know that's nobody's intention, but that is part of the history that you need to be aware of. So shifting a little bit, we want to talk about our ways of life. What does that mean to us? I think that's really, it's essential to have a foundation in this, as well as people that are going to be engaging with our communities. I would assume for many of you on topics like our relationships to the land, our observations of the weather systems in our communities, how the climate may be changing, all of those different things, probably other topics I didn't even bring up. Understanding how we think of our relationship to our homelands and how we think of our ways of life is really important. We always like to take a moment to acknowledge some of our community leaders. Obviously, this is not a comprehensive slide. If we could somehow put every single leader on a slide, I mean, we just would be here all day, because we really are standing on the shoulders of generations and generations and generations of leaders before us who in their time made decisions for those that would come after them to make sure that we would be able to continue our way of life and to pass that way of life down to future generations. These are some of the incredible leaders that have now all passed on, but within their regions and across the state really embodied this spirit of thinking of the next generation. And I think one of the things that sets maybe the concept of Indigenous leadership apart from, I don't know, how you might think of leadership in a more corporate standpoint or perhaps a Western context, is this built-in commitment to thinking about the next generation. We are taught that in our time, in our lives, we have a responsibility to honor the legacy of those that came before us and to make way for those that will come after us. And that is the responsibility of all of us who are alive today. And I would say that extends to all of us in the room, but it's not necessarily a value that all of us are taught. But that is something that we're cognizant of as leaders in our communities, and leaders that you may be engaging with. They're thinking actively about those that came before them and those that will come after them. Next slide. So I'll give you all a second to read this. So in 2020, First Alaskans Institute held a virtual truth-telling space on protecting our ways of life. That was called the Protecting Our Ways of Life Tribunal and Summit. And during that time, we invited people from all over the state of Alaska, from our Alaska Native people specifically, to share not only why our ways of life matter and what it means to them, but also to highlight the systemic issues that still exist that may prevent us from being able to steward our lands, to practice our ways of life without criminalization. These are ongoing issues that our communities still experience today. And so one of those individuals who shared this incredible story, and we pulled this quote from it, but he talks about how when we're not able to get out on the land, we experience not only a literal hunger in our stomachs, but also a hunger in our mind, body, and soul, as he says. And it's so important to remember that when we go out on the land, when we go looking for moose or looking for caribou or looking for whale or looking for salmon, when we go fishing, that we're not ever doing it just to fill our bellies or fill our freezers, but that woven around this entire process is how our people stay healthy, how our people stay well, how we care for our mental health, how we keep our familial bonds really strong. Our ways of life mean so much more to us than simply harvesting a nutritious meal. And so you'll notice that at First Alaskans, we more frequently say our ways of life, as opposed to the word subsistence. But many people will still use that term, and we're in some ways speaking to the same things, but in some ways we may not be. It depends on who's using the term. The term subsistence historically has not always encompassed all of the other dimensions. All of the mind-body connection, the way that our ways of life nurture our spirit, our sense of wellness, our soul, as he said. Sometimes that's not always encompassed in the term subsistence. Okay, next slide. So when we began our time together, we talked about how our people really have 10,000 plus years of ancestral connections to this place, ongoing connections to our homelands. And as part of that, that means that we have, each generation born has accepted the responsibility of stewarding and caring for that land for the generations that will come after them. So built into our harvesting practices, built into what we teach the next generation is how to be conscientious around only taking what you need, how to make sure that you're treating the animals with respect so that they'll always come back to us, how to make sure that we're not damaging the land in a way that will harm future generations or harm the land itself or harm the animals. And remembering that we're just one part of this kind of bigger ecosystem. So when we say our ways of life, we're really thinking about how we've been caretakers of this place for thousands of years. And sometimes that is also lost when people come into our communities. They may not realize that that each successive generation of leaders is thinking about this, is preparing the next generation of people to take on this mantle of caring for our homelands in perpetuity. But it's a really important thing to remember as you're coming in to our communities. We are not a special interest group or a stakeholder group. Yeah, as Lagunai says, that's the S word. You will probably irritate people if you accidentally say special interest group or stakeholder, because from our perspective, this is our home. This has always been our home. We will always be here, no matter who else comes and goes, no matter what government settles here. The United States is not that old in comparison to how long our people have been here on our homelands. And so for us, this is our home. When you come here, you're a guest. And it's our responsibility as hosts to make sure that you feel welcome, to take care of you, to ensure that you know where to go, you know who to talk to, all of that stuff. But as guests, it's also important to remember that this is our home. We've always been here. So we encourage you not to use the stakeholder word or the special interest word. If you can, again, I know that that's not always possible depending on, I'm just thinking about, well, I'm just thinking about, like if you're working with a state or federal agency that hasn't quite gotten there yet or something like that. But, within your sphere of influence, encourage you to do that. And then, here, I'll go to you first.
So that's great. I hadn't heard that as the S word before, so thank you. How would you then characterize the different, we talked already, there's sometimes a city government, sometimes a village corporation, a regional corporation, the tribe, federal agencies. There's all these different groups and sometimes they overlap. How do you then characterize and talk about the groups as independent entities?
I would call them partners if they're your partners in a project. I would refer to them by their specific.
So that people on Zoom can hear you.
Oh, I forgot their Zoom. So if you're in a relationship with them, if you're working with them, then they're your partners. If you're just describing kind of the local context, then you can describe them as you just did, right? Like, this is the tribal government, this is the city government, this is the school board, right? And the reason for that is in the context of Western governance, right? What is a stakeholder? A stakeholder has no power. A stakeholder is somebody who they're a member of the public, and the member of the public gets to use a public process. See, all of this stuff is connected to the legal power that Native people have been wrested from. So these terms really matter, because when you tell a tribal government they are a stakeholder, what are you telling them? They're just a member of the public, right? So it's not just about what is a convenient term of art, it's a legal term of art. And these words further distance people. So special interest is especially used by some of the hunting and fishing resource, what do you call them? Outdoor council kind of folks. They use this to diminish our inherent rights as Native people in the state. And it has been used in legal cases against us. So there's a reason that there's a sharp edge around these words. And when you're trying to build relationship, you want to come in with your best foot, right? So that's why I was saying, try to steer away from these words, because these are sending signals. And they have legal implications. Even if in your mind they don't, this is the experience that our people have lived. Can I speak to this? Do you guys all know who this is? This is one of the reasons that I don't mind her name not being on here, because I want people to know who this is. It's Katie John. This is Katie John. This is Grandma Katie. Grandma Katie stood for all of us as Native people in this fight for us to just be able to be Native. When Kunwigu talks about our ways of life being more than just the hand-to-mouth action, I heard Linda Jewell recently say on our Elders and Youth stage, and I thought she said it so beautifully. We were addressing this deep harm that boarding schools have caused. And she was responding to our keynotes, who had really been very courageous and shared some really hard truths about their experiences. And one of the things she said in responding to them and holding them up was to recognize that when everything else about who we are became illegal, our language, our cultures, our dances, our ceremonies, raising our children, our clan structures, our religious practices, even though they're not religious, it's our spirituality. When all of that stuff became criminalized, all of it went into the practice of our ways of life. And that's where they have been kept and cared for. That is why Native people today, even if they don't speak their language, even if they haven't had a chance to be connected directly to their cultures, they're still practicing our ways of life. Everything about who we are is embedded in our ability to be in relationship to our lands and our waters and our animal relatives. So when we talk about our ways of life, we're not talking about subsistence, right? And if you're coming into our communities to do work with us, you got to know what that looks like in our community, because it's not going to be on your timeline. And if you're doing work in our communities now, you already are experiencing that. Just some protocol stuff that I think is important to know. When we experience death in our communities, the whole community is experiencing that death, not just the family. So if you plan to have a meeting or a community engagement during a time when that happened, and it was all planned and you traveled out there and you're all set to do it, you should cancel, right? You should cancel. It's respect, it's relationship. And then you take your food that you brought for your meeting and you take it to the community doings. Now, every community has its own little nuances. Some communities, you might go and speak to your partners in the community to say, how should we handle this? What do you want to do? What's the right thing to do here? And then you follow their lead. Hey, you made it. Watlakidak is here. So those are really important things to know. Also, because our spirituality is connected to the practice of our ways of life, there are things for us that might go right over your head if you're not aware of it. For instance, up in the interior, when folks are going hunting, they don't say they're going hunting, for the most part. People in communities, they'll say they're going look around. We're just going look around. We're just going out in the country. That means they're going hunting, right? And there's a reason they don't say that. Because you're not trying to bum luck yourself, right? You don't talk boldly as if some animal is just going to give himself to you because you presented yourself out in the land. You have to be humble. So when you hear those things, there's certain things that our people will say that are a clue that something is going on that you might be interested in learning about. So just as a heads up, there are phrases like that you might not have known, right? But they'll give you a signal, especially if you're doing research around wildlife management or you're doing research about certain species of animals. It is our people who engage in going to look around who are the ones who are the direct observers and engagers in those spaces. And this is a ceremonial aspect of our ways of life. even if people don't talk about it that way. So understanding the nuance is important, but also this is where it really hurts us. We are criminalized still to this day. We're criminalized. That means that we have a fight, an ongoing fight, right? So there's all kinds of things happening in our communities, and we're constantly fighting to protect our ways of life. We'll let Watlakirak introduce herself real quick.
Sangait la utlang, the day is getting good. Wafal Girak Hinudi Kiang, Barbara Blake, Ya'atsatai Hinudi Kiang. My name is Wafal Girak. My English name is Barbara Blake. Sorry I'm late. Fog woman, did you tell him Fog woman didn't show up for us until this morning? And I am from Prince of Wales Island. My family is Haida and Tlingit. On my mother's side, I'm Yak Janas, or Raven from the Shark House. My grandfather's people were Tlea or the dog salmon people from Tloak. My father's people are from Chestachina, and they're Nilchina, the Sky Clan. My father's people are Athabaskan. Currently live in Santa Kahini, otherwise known as Juneau, and I've been working at First Alaskans alongside these awesome ladies for a number of years now. I did want to, just to piggyback on what Loganai was just sharing here. And maybe I'll just make you get back up, but I love how you describe the real people and the connection of why all of our names, Haras means people, Tlingit means people, and oftentimes people are offended. Why are you Haida people the only real people? And I really want Loganai to describe her story of that.
Yeah, Ganesh Chish. So you guys have heard this, right? No? Okay, so our names for our different and very diverse Native people, as diverse as we are, usually have something in common, and that is it means and it refers to us as the real human beings. And I was at a meeting not too long ago, and one of the non-natives that was participating took offense when someone referred to being a real human being and felt like that was excluding him as a non-native from being a real human being. And our native family was kind of surprised by that, because it was such a different take on it. And the response that I shared was essentially this: the name for our people has been around for thousands of years, longer than non-native people have been in Alaska. So what do you think our ancestors were defining? They were defining who we are, as opposed to our animal relatives, who that long ago we still spoke to, who still spoke to us. So you live in a world that there are other people here. And so you're defining who you are in relationship to them. The other component of that is we live between multiple worlds as Native people. Our cosmology of the world is massive. And there's always a very thin veil between our connection to who we are today in this reality and our ancestors. And we still practice those ceremonial ways in some of our communities, and they're coming back in a lot of our communities. So for instance, in our Tlingit communities, some of us are told that after we experience a great loss that we don't eat seaweed. And when I was younger, I didn't understand it, because seaweed is one of the cornerstones of our diet. And it wasn't until I was older that I really understood, is because when you experience a great loss, that veil between life and death is really, really thin. And that's why we say, be careful. These are the times when you're going to stumble, you're going to stub your toe, you're going to cut yourself with a knife, you're going to bonk your shin bones, you're going to trip and fall over, you're going to be careless with your words, you're going to hurt people you didn't mean to, because our unconscious is so directly tied to that spiritual world that we're not fully operating with everything because we've experienced such a deep loss. The recognition that seaweed lives between two worlds. It is both on the land and in the sea. And because of that relationship, when you experience a great loss, you have to forego eating that food so that you don't get pulled over to the other side. It's a beautiful way of life. Beautiful. And we need it. We need it. As Native people, we need it, but Alaska needs it. Some serious damage has been done to our homelands and is continuing to be done. So we just finished talking about Grandma Katie. But if you don't know who she is, her name's Katie John. You can Google her and read up about what she did, because her court case that she started, how many decades ago now, is still an ever-present danger at the United States Supreme Court to this day. And again, it's fighting for us to be able to be Native, which is ludicrous and stardate 2022, but here we are.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing before we move away from this slide. And I didn't get to hear your whole keynote, but I got to hear little bits and pieces of it. And one of the messages that I heard was the value of Indigenous knowledge and being able to respect that and bring that into the whatever you guys are working on. When we talk about our ways of life, like these ladies have talked about, they're not siloed in this, we're going to go hunt and feed our belly. Our ways of life are our lifeblood in everything that we do, and they've been passed on for generations to generations. So while we're out taking a look around, we're paying attention not only to the animals that are on the land, but what's changing and happening. And we've heard stories from our grandfathers and our grandmothers of what's happened previously, and we pass those on. One of the greatest examples that I use in this is my own language, Shuxtun. We have so many ways to describe the weather. Because if you go to Kodiak, you can't just say it's raining. That means absolutely nothing to us. There are so many variations of rain. And all of those things that are embedded in our culture and who we are, embedded in our ways of life, are teaching us as our future generations, and we will teach and pass on what's happening in the world around us. That's the true essence of that Indigenous knowledge, and that's why it's so valuable. We see climate change happening, and so have our grandparents, and they've watched it all change. So anyways, moving on. Yep, you want to add?
Yeah, one more thing. These ladies have heard me tell this story quite a bit, but just to give you a clear understanding of what all of this combination of our culture, our history, who we are as Native people, and how they all come together and coalesce in a way that helps us take care of each other, helps us take care of this place, and helps take care of all of our generations. I always use my son's story, his coming of age story, as a really solid example during this slide set, and it just hits home and really helps to have a better understanding of where we're coming from as Native people. My son is, I've been a single mom for majority of my son's life. He's a young man, right there. That's Nate. That's my boy. And actually, right around the time when this photo was taken, I was a single mom for his first 12 years of his life, and a single mom to the nth degree. Like my ex-husband was in prison majority of my son's life, and still is. And so taking care of a young man as a woman and trying to figure out how to teach them and raise them and teach them the things that a man should know is near to impossible. But I did the best I could. And One summer, he went out fishing with a group of fishermen to subsist in Kloak. And he brought back enough fish. His take from that salmon was enough to feed not only us, but to feed multiple generations, to feed aunties, uncles. Multiple households were fed from the salmon that he provided that summer. And Liz's mom, Lagunai's mom, said it's time for his coming of age ceremony. And for me, that was a big deal, because who comes of age at 12 years old? He's becoming a man. And I told him that. I said, hey, bud, do you know what this ceremony is going to be? And we were having a conversation as we were walking to the beach. And I was carrying all the beach supplies, the chairs, the firewood, all the things we'd need to have a good time. And he said, no, I don't really know what this ceremony is about. And I said, this is your coming of age, baby. You're going to be acknowledged as a man now. And this acknowledgement is not just acknowledging you as a man, but it's acknowledging that you can provide for our entire community. That's the marker of a man. That means that you're not just looking out for yourself, but everybody else. And when you can provide for all of them, this is the opportunity that you have to show our community that you are now a man. And he said, I'm going to be a man now? I was like, yeah, bud. And he said, I'll carry that box, Mom. Grabbed the box from me and started walking down the beach, trying to be a man and understanding that this was an important marker in his life. And at that ceremony, we had about 7 different people gift him publicly. He gifted everybody who showed up to his ceremony with salmon, and people gifted him publicly with tools that he would need to carry on the tradition of fishing and providing for our people. And every single one who stood up made a public declaration to help guide him into manhood. And in that moment, I said, this is how our community takes care of each other. This is how I know that I don't have to try and figure out how to teach a man how to be a man all by myself. But that our ceremonies, everything wrapped into one salmon, is not just food to mouth, but it's so much bigger than that. It's a huge picture, and it's all tied together. And when I think about what he's learning and his responsibility as he's growing into his manhood and with the education he's getting from so many people, he's also learning that there's a responsibility bigger than himself. When we went out fishing in Akwan territory, and I had to get a permit to go fishing, he didn't yet because he wasn't 16 yet. I said, Mom, why do you have to get a permit? Why do you have to pay to go fishing? And I was like, well, honey, it's the law. And he said, but this is the homeland of the Akwan. And I was like, yeah, baby, it is. And he said, well, shouldn't we be paying the Akwan to fish here? And I was like, that's very valid. What can we do to fix that? And he said, we should give part of this fish to the Akwan. And so he made it a standard for our family, whenever we are harvesting on Akwan land, that we give part of our harvest to the Akwan leaders, to their matriarch. We give our jellies, our berries, fish, whatever we gather from that place, because it's not my homeland. It belongs to them. My homeland, as I said before, is Heidelberg, Kloak, and Chestachina. And so making sure that he knew, and I think he was 14, he knew at 14 years old that that was his responsibility, to take care of those other community members. And he's learning all these things as a part of our way of life. That's why we don't call it subsistence anymore, because it's wrapped into so many different aspects of who we are. Okay. All right. Okay. Oh, the fun slides. Thanks, guys. Let's talk about policy. So this is actually supposed to be a highway, but I call it a river. It's a river, right? Looks like a river. These are all the different eras of federal Indian law that have touched Alaska Native and Native American peoples. Every single one of these eras was a point in time where the federal government was trying to eliminate our existence, right? From extermination. That was literally an era where this is the time of the Indian Wars, where they were harming and killing our communities and our peoples. The treaty making era, which, by the way, just as a side note, as we're talking about Alaska, Congress had created a law that essentially made treaty making like treaty making was no longer going to exist after that certain date and time, and Alaska Native people were recognized, and Alaska wasn't even purchased at that time when the treaty making era ended. So that's why we don't have treaties in Alaska, if anybody was wondering. Removal to reservations, assimilation, allotment, all of these different eras were moments in time where our people were either being forcefully removed from their land, forcefully removed from their culture, up until self-determination and self-governance era, which we're still in this era today. Important to know all of these different eras. I'm not going to go into each one, but as you're thinking about the history and the legacy of this country and what it means to have these laws that build themselves upon each of our shoulders as Native peoples, we still carry them today. If you look at the way government functions and how they set a standard for how everyday citizens operate in the United States and citizens of Alaska operate, the government really tells a story that either makes or breaks how we're treated as Native people. And through their history and how things have gone about and shaped today, you see that a lot of Alaska Native leaders, a lot of Native American leaders are starting to take leadership roles throughout. And in Alaska, so many other people are starting to come to our people and saying, we need to have this conversation. And it's a direct result of how the government decides it's going to treat our people, is how everyday citizens usually show up and treat us. And we witness that. And we witness a flip-flop between administrations, between how our communities are treated. And I want to say that self-determination, self-governance era is important to note because this gives us compacting and contracting. Did you cover that slide already? Okay. So this is where we're allowed to compact and contract with the federal government and now the state government. And so this is an important era that we're still in today, but peeling back the fingers of the patriarchal systems that still want to have a say in how we govern our own people and how we've governed our own people inherently since time immemorial has been a consistent struggle, and it still continues even under the self-determination and self-governance era.
I just wanted to add two things real quick. There is actually one treaty that's relevant in Alaska that a lot of people forget about, and that's the Treaty of Cession. Because in the Treaty of Cession with Russia, one of the terms was that the Native people would be treated the same way that they treated the Native people already part of the United States. So that's why we got scooped up into the general course of dealing of the United States with the indigenous peoples of this place. The other thing is, just to say this, earlier I talked about the legacy that researchers and scientists have, Western scientists have in our communities. They were a part of every single part of this. Okay, so this is kind of referring to the policy piece, but the policy piece was informed by all the research and the scientific theories of the day. So that's kind of the legacy that you're dealing with here as you're trying to rebuild different types of relationships. My assumption is with Native people.
This is, yeah, just sit there and read it. You can keep going. So this is an important term that you've probably heard many times. If you're from down south, it's used a lot. In Alaska, still frequently when we find ourselves amongst Native spaces, like when we go to National Congress of American Indians, when they have their annual gathering, we'll use this term a lot. Indian country is a legal term, right? It's reservations. It is land that is held in trust by the federal government that is connected to a tribe. And so Metlakatla is the only reservation we have in Alaska, but we do have other trust land in Alaska because guess what? Under Obama and what Lagunai just mentioned, that the Treaty of Cession said we as Native people in Alaska will be treated the same way as every other Native person down south. So in other words, the same laws that apply to them have to apply to us in accordance with the Treaty of Cession. So land into trust, tribes can put land into trust. They make an application, it's giant paperwork, and then they give it to the Secretary of Interior and say, Secretary of Interior, we want to put this area of land into trust. And then that becomes trust land, quote unquote, Indian country. You'll also hear Indian country referred to us as a people. We are Indian country. And so when we talk about each other and we talk about our communities, we're talking about Indian country. And so you'll often hear that term as well. So Indian country exists in Alaska, continuing to grow. It kind of halted under Trump because with each administration, as I said before, we kind of go back and forth between what rights are going to be recognized and what rights aren't. It just paused. But there are a number of applications sitting on Secretary Holland's desk as we speak. Okay, jumping into the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. Okay, do we want to save? I'll just do this one really quick in questions. Yeah? Okay. So INCSA is important to note that this was our land claims between our Native people and the federal government. Congress created the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act in 1971, 44 million acres of land, almost $1 billion distributed to our, then at the time, 13 regional corporations and 203 village corporations. A lot of the village corporations have since converged into one, or they merged into their regional corporation. It's all, we don't have 203 village corporations, in other words. And the 13th regional corporation is also non-existent anymore. The 13th was set up for those who were not physically in Alaska at the time INCSA was signed. So all of our Native people who were going to college out of state, who were, relocated, they enrolled in the 13th Regional Corporation. Congress, INCSA has been amended so many times, and one of the amendments was to allow all of those who were in the 13th Regional Corporation to be enrolled in their original homelands corporation. So important to note, INCSA also was signed without the okay or we approve this as Native people. And in fact, a fun little story is that the then president of AFN, INCSA abolished our Aboriginal hunting and fishing rights, extinguished them. And so AFN, the Alaska Federation of Natives here in Alaska, was getting ready to vote as a body to say, we do not support this. We do not support INCSA, we do not support what's happening. And they were getting ready to vote, and they got a call from Senator Ted Stevens. And Senator Stevens said, if you vote no on this, it's not going to pass Congress and you will get nothing. But if you just say nothing, let it go through, we'll fix it in ANILCA. We'll give you your rights back to hunt, fish, and gather on your lands. Another important fact about INCSA is that the 7I revenue sharing was a caveat that was built into it. And something that I always like to remind folks is that our INCSA corporations were formed during a time period for our people when we had maybe a handful of businessmen, a handful of lawyers among all of us. And so who did we turn to at the time? Who were the business people in Alaska in 1971? Resource extractors, right? Majority of the business people in Alaska were oil executives, mining executives, fishing, they came from all of these different walks of life. And so that's usually who we had to turn to lead a number of these corporations. And another factor that's really interesting with INCSA is that 70% of what any one corporation makes in profit on natural resources is split among all 12 corporations. So Alaska was big in timber for a long time. 70% of the profits of whatever they made on timber was split among all of the other regional corporations. Can you imagine if Walmart decided to start sharing profits with Target, right? But it was written into Congress that in perpetuity we would always be sharing with each other. And it's actually helped a number of corporations from going bankrupt. So fun little facts about INCSA. We could spend a very long time just on INCSA alone, so I won't go too much in depth. Did you want to say anything?
I would say that one of the things that you hear often when people talk about INCSA is they say the following phrasing. Through INCSA, the federal government gave Alaska Native people $1 billion and 44 million acres of land. What's wrong with that statement? Yeah. So when you're in our communities and you're talking about these things, that's one of the things, though, don't step on that landmine. Don't be the person that talks about, having ANCSA give us our land. We barely held on to even a fraction of our lands, right? Now, ANCSA, however, only dealt with ANCSA. It did not deal with everything that was a precursor. So special trust lands, like Barb was already talking about, allotments, there's still a lot of native allotments. If you're doing research in our communities, we have city governments, tribal governments, we have regional corporations, village corporations, we have the state government, we have the federal government, we have special allotted lands that people can't sell without secretarial approval. It's a maze. It's a maze. And for other people to have to figure out how to do all this stuff, and our own people don't even get access to this information either. So it can be a real convoluted nightmare to try to untangle it and figure out who the property, quote unquote, owners are, and then who the real owners of that whole place is, and making sure you develop the relationship with all of them. And I know we're out of time pretty much, yeah? Cool. Yeah.
And just so everybody knows, you can get the PDF.
Yeah, well, the PDFs will be available. We'll make sure you get a copy. This is just a pebble on the tip of the iceberg. If anyone hasn't told you that yet, you really got just a baby flavor of all of this. We could spend a semester-long course on this. And I originally wanted this slide set to be over 300 slides. You told them? It should be 300 slides.
By rights, it
Yeah.
should be.
Okay, questions?
Yeah, thank you. So like, according to that note, it's like regional corporations and village corporations, they both have service rights. So is it only limited to minerals for regional and timber for village? So I get a little bit confused.
So the regional corporations have surface and subsurface rights. And so on all of the village corporation land, the regional corporation owns the subsurface rights for the most part. There's some caveats to that. We could go down that road later, but the village corporations own only the surface rights for the most part. And I say the most part because there's been some amendments to ANCSA that have changed that. Oh, no, yeah, it's not just specific to timber. It's all the things above.
Yeah, so just for those folks who are joining in online and maybe you want to submit a question on the app, just a reminder to open up your sidebar. You navigate to the NNA Q&A, and then you, at the top there, the drop-down menu, you choose Dillingham Room. That's the room we're in right now, and I see some questions already coming in, which is great. One question is, can you share from your perspective how researchers early in their careers can intentionally build partnerships with northern communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one important note I will make is that relationships take time and they take trust, and they take not just coming in for a specific purpose. We were building a grant most recently with a funding agency who we had to explain profusely that as we embark on this journey, we don't get to just automatically go march in and say, here's our paper, can you sign it? Tell us your information. Let us know all of the secrets of your community and all of the shared values and culture and who you are. We have to go in and have time with them, build trust, make time to not go in with a purpose. Laguna and I were in Heidelberg, which is, my home community. And we were there for work, and my aunt stopped us on the bridge and she looked at us and she said, come back for the clan house dedication. Don't come back for work. And she was telling us very clearly in that statement that we had come too many times just as our business hats on. And we have to do that due diligence as Native people too. We don't get to just march into a community and think we have an automatic relationship and think that we can march in and say that we want things and we want all the things to happen and can you help us figure out all this stuff? And so that's a really important note. Go in for the celebrations. Go jump in the kitchen, go help serve, go pick up trash, go be a part of the community.
I hope, and I'm assuming most of you had read like Decolonizing Methodologies, the books that have really helped people have a better insight into the way that Western paradigm-based research can be very ill-fitting for communities. And the different ways that you can approach that as younger researchers coming up through your programs, this is the opportune time to start building relationship with communities that you feel a connection to. And one of the research that I'm thinking about, her name is Sonia Ibarra. Have you guys had a chance to meet Sonia? She did her field work for her PhD in a couple different communities, but specifically in mine. And she came in partnership with the tribe because the tribe was experiencing, our community was experiencing a real impact of the sea otters on our clam beds. And it happened to align with her interests. And so there, a conversation and a relationship started to partner. So she did her research in service to our community. She did not do her research in service to her own self-interest. So she really worked hard to build a long-term relationship that is continuing to serve our community. And she works with our young people and she trains them in methodologies, takes them out in the field. She comes to our celebrations. She comes just to hang out. She is now she's working in the Damumta Fellows program. I think you might have heard of that a little bit already. But when she started as a younger researcher, she was coming from a place as an indigenous person herself from Mexico about how not to do it wrong. And so as younger researchers, like building in a really good way moving forward, that's absolutely important. Wouldn't just focus on your own studies, get out there and start connecting to communities. What's that? Oh, yeah. Some protocols. So when you go into our communities, one of the things that I love about our people is that we have a tremendous sense of humor. And if you get to come in and build relationship, it might surprise you just how funny our people are. I have an uncle, his name's Bill, and he used to be the tribal president for Tlingit and Haida. And he has like the world's straightest face you've ever seen in your life. Like he's so serious. And then like pretty much almost everything he says has some sort of joke or punchline to it. And he's always telling stories. But if you don't know him, you might think he looks really stern. So getting to be able to get past those things is important. The other thing is there are some red flags for you in our communities. If you're in our community and people start referring to you by your title, something's wrong. Because our people are not formal that way with people that they trust. So if you start getting the Mr. and Mrs. treatment, that's a signal to you that there's something going on because they're distancing themselves from you. In some cultures, use of titles is a sign of respect. And depending on where you are in the community, it might be okay. If you're in the school, of course, they're still training our kids to call the teachers Mr. and Mrs., right? because that paradigm hasn't changed yet. But if it's just in the community, that's a big red flag. You got to figure out, what are you doing that's causing this distance to grow? Were there any other questions online or in the room? Okay.
Everyone could hear. I think this is really important, and I think a lot of people will really benefit in hearing your advice and answers to this. So the question is, how do you recommend navigating co-production of knowledge when projects have already been developed without Indigenous consultation or partnership?
Start over. Own up to it. One of the exercises that might be helpful for folks who are in that predicament is to go back through and read your proposal, but try to read it from the lens of the Indigenous community itself. And try to figure out where those things have not matched up. And then own it. Because we're humans. We make mistakes. Until we know better, we can't do better. But once we know, then we have to do better. So if you have an opportunity in terms of a co-production of knowledge, and you're like already well down the path, and now you're at this kind of epiphany in your life, and you're saying, oh gosh, I wish I could do this over. I wish I would have done this differently. Do it differently. Do it differently. Talk to your partners about it, be honest about it, ask them for their perspective, use it as a learning opportunity, and then incorporate it and move on so that you're actually implementing that learning through the rest and remainder. And you're doing it in a co-production methodology that works for the community or the people that you're working closest to. Follow their lead. So it sounds kind of funny to say start over, but in reality, isn't that what we do every time we make a big mistake with people we care about? And then we have to kind of say, you know, I'm sorry, I want to do this better. Can we start over? Right? We already know how to do that. So let's find a pathway to yes, to get to true co-production, rather than continuing down a pathway to calling it co-production and knowing full well it's not. So start over. Yeah.
This is such a good question. Thanks for your advice. We've heard from some early career scientists that are in this position where there is the question, they are graduate students with a researcher, and the students realize this is not true co-production, but they are in this situation where they are, as early career scientists, wanting to do the right thing and are kind of stuck in that, in this power dynamic. And I'm just wondering if you have any advice. Of course, the very best would be, you know, move on and find a different person, but we also all know there's like, you know, these are career stages. Do you have any thoughts for early career scientists?
Yeah, Ganesh for the question. And again, I would point to Sonia because she, I think, went through this same situation herself. But when you're early in your career and you don't feel like you have the ability to speak truth to power, then you need to use your network. And you can still have a meaningful relationship with the people you're working with and figure out how to do it in a way that challenges that paradigm of that power dynamic, while also continuing to really advance and push for what you're trying to do. And the reason you use your networks is because there are a lot of people, especially older scientists, who probably know a workaround. And they just might not have the opportunity to have access to that person. And so that's really important. So for early career people, for them not to be on their own, but to have a really strong support network and people who are their advocates within systems so they don't have to carry that burden themselves, especially our Native people who are in these early career positions, especially our younger BIPOC folk. Like, they should not have to carry the burden of dealing with all of this stuff. It's the older people's responsibility to remove the burden for them. We hosted one of our racial equity dialogues at the university here a few years ago now with all of the leadership from the University of Alaska Anchorage. And we were doing our closing circle, and one of the top leaders within the school, within the university, he said, you know, we're kind of trained in this education system that when a young person comes to you with struggles that they're having, whether it's administrative or financial, bureaucratic stuff, you know, coursework, advice and guidance, career stuff, when they come to you with a problem, you try to help them by, you know, giving them advice and guidance about how to get over, how to get under, how to get around, how to get through these burdens. He said, if it never once crossed my mind that we should just remove the barrier, right? And we're putting all of that advocacy role on younger people because we as older people lack the courage to confront bullies and toxic behavior within our working environments and racism. Yeah, all of it, right? All of it. And too often that burden falls on the people who are experiencing it the most with the least amount of power to change it. And so the issue isn't just early career people need to do this, it's also the older career people need to clear the path. And for the younger career folks, keep authentic and real relationships center. Don't let somebody else's power dynamics shred your authenticity, because that's a death knell for your career as a researcher within a Native community. You can't recover from that. It's going to follow you around because we talk to each other. They'll be like, ooh, maybe keep looking, you know? So as early career people, you have to do what you can to stay authentic in those relationships and keep pushing for what real partnership means in the co-production of knowledge. And I guess I would say too, this is something that in this place where you have a confluence of meeting between Indigenous ways of knowing and being and Western ways of knowing and being, and that is that people feel like there has to be some sort of equality or equivalency to those values and their use in a co-production model. But what I would say is, if they already exist and have existed here for thousands of years, there's no need for them to be replaced by somebody else's and for them to have to be made equivalent, because that's erasure. So as you're thinking about what those authentic relationships look like, be also thinking about authentic relationship to value, to structure and knowledge. And I think that probably therein is also a few opportunities for early career people to actually know a lot more than older career people. So I guess that's my response to that question, unless anybody else wants to. I think we're done. Okay, well, I again want to say to both of you guys, thanks so much for stepping in and doing this for us. We have our largest fundraiser of the year on Saturday, guys. Like, our entire team is like right now. And they stepped in for us, so can't thank them enough. And thank you folks for reaching out. This is usually a 2-day session. I'm sure they told you already. We microdosed you. Is that what it's called? And we look forward to more time and engagement with navigating the Native Arctic. Isn't that what NNA stands for?
Kuyana Gunoshish, thank you so much again to First Alaskans Institute for making it work and for being here today. I really appreciate it. I really like the value of in every chair a leader. And I think you have provided a lot of really great first steps and some actions that we can all take just to make the Arctic a better space for everybody. So thank you again so much for being here. Really appreciate it. Could I get another